thank you so much for joining us this evening. My name's Antoinette Lattouf. I am the co-founder of Media Diversity Australia, one of the organisations that's partnered in hosting these events. I'm also a senior journalist at Network 10. Before I go along and talk about the structure of this evening and introduce our fabulous guests, I do want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which I join you, the Wangal people. I pay my respect to elders past, present and emerging. Now, this series of webinars on diversity in journalism is a partnership between the Scanlon Foundation, which is a foundation that aspires to see Australia advance as a welcoming, prosperous and cohesive nation, particularly related to the transition of migrants into Australian society. The Walkley Foundation, which you'd probably all be aware, celebrates the very best practice journalism, and Media Diversity Australia, which is a not-for-profit organisation that's working towards our news media looking and sounding like our very wonderful and multicultural country. So today's session is about the language and the power of storytelling and how impactful that can be when it's done right and respectfully. But conversely, and equally importantly, how detrimental it can be on diverse communities when it's not done well. There will be two fabulous people speaking in the latter half of this session. That's James Button and his guest Nor Shanino. But before I go into tell you a little bit about these two speakers tonight, let me go through a little bit of housekeeping. Let you know that this is being recorded. This session is being recorded, and it's my understanding it will be available online later. Everybody should be on mute. Usually at these sorts of events, it's where I tell people where the toilets are, but I'm hoping because you're dialing in from home or your workplace that you've got that sorted. James and I will chat for about 10 minutes about his experiences as a storyteller and a journalist. Then James will interview Nor. And during that discussion between James and Nor's interaction, I encourage people to put any questions in the chat function. They'll chat for about half an hour, and at the end of that, there'll be plenty of time to answer your questions. So please engage, and it doesn't matter how soon you pop that in. I'll be keeping an eye on them, and we'll be coming back to those questions at the end of their discussion. And that question can be to either James, Nor, or myself. Okay, so I will bring in James Button. So James is a journalist, speechwriter, editor and policy communications advisor based in Melbourne. I'm sorry to hear you're based in Melbourne. He's worked for The Age, the Grattan Institute, and as a speechwriter for Prime Minister Kevin Rudd. He has won 3 Walkley Awards for feature writing and written 2 books, Speechless, A Year in My Father's Business, and Comeback, The Fall and Rise of Geelong. Welcome, James.
Thanks, Antoinette, and great to be here. Really a pleasure.
So James, in 2020, for those who aren't aware or haven't seen the content, you participated in a Zoom roundtable with a diverse group of young people who grew up in the Flemington Kensington Housing Commission flats. And I guess what made your content and storytelling so powerful was the openness and willingness of the young people to share their stories and their experiences. What made this series a success? What enabled their stories and truth to shine?
Well, Antoinette, the series, which was published by the Scanlon Foundation and in The Guardian in July last year, began as a Zoom call between about 12 to 14 young African Australians from the high-rise flats in various parts of Melbourne, in the inner suburbs of Melbourne. And look, that first call that we had was really important because it established a basis of trust, I think. What was fascinating to my co-writer on this story and myself, my co-writer was Julie Sago, was just how sort of willing the young people were on this Zoom call and keen to share their stories, to step out and speak about their lives growing up in the high-rise flats around Melbourne. And that story was pretty counterintuitive, I think, for a lot of people. People who haven't grown up in public housing or in high-rise tend to have a certain fixed view of the high-rise. That view tends to be that these are really tough places to live in, not necessarily much fun to live in. And people who live right up against the flats in the inner city might even have that view. But actually, that's not the case. That's not the story that we heard from the young people in this Zoom call. They told us a story of real allegiance, of really strong loyalty to the places they grew up in, to the communities they grew up in the flats. And that was really the basis of our story. And it was just, Julie and I were immediately interested. We could see straight away that the if you like, stereotypical view was just not right in this case.
You mentioned the stereotypical view, and often that's the one that is most, widely broadcast. That can also have a detrimental and silencing effect on those who have been misrepresented to want to correct the record or show a different perspective. Did you encounter that reluctance? And if so, how do you overcome that?
Well, in this case, the young people we spoke to were not reluctant at all. They really were keen to tell their stories. But you're quite right that people who have grown up in the flats sometimes absorb that sense from the wider community that to live in the high-rise flats is to live a kind of lesser, existence in terms of the quality of life in the flats. And really, they wanted to say to us, look, we had real community in these places. We looked after each other. There was, open spaces where, like 300 kids might be just playing together. You never had to look out and call a friend because there was always a friend there. And there was a real sense of just almost like an older Australian life where people just went up to each other in the street and went into each other's houses. That was how people inside the high-rise towers experienced life. So, but at the same time, people were often aware that people outside did think that it must be really terrible to live in these places. And I think people on this Zoom call really want to say, no, that's not the case.
And one of the things you would have recognised, given your career has spanned over 2 decades, the industry has changed enormously, probably at a faster rate than ever before. Nuanced and good storytelling and relationship building takes time. Trust takes time. And we know that time is something that journalists have less and less of. So I'm interested in the amount of time you had from idea inception to getting this published, just to give a bit of context.
Yeah, you're absolutely right about all that, Antoinette. Somebody once said about journalism, it's the art of arriving too late as quickly as possible. And, we had more time. We were luckier than some day-to-day reporters, perhaps like yourself, are in terms of media reporting, because we did have some weeks to pull this story together and to build our interviews and to go back to people. But what sped it up was that the Guardian accepted our piece for publication, but they said, oh, it'll run in about 6 weeks when we can get it together. And then the hard lockdown of the high-rise towers happened in the COVID. And suddenly the Guardian went from we want it in 6 weeks to saying we want it tomorrow.
Yeah, right.
So then we had to there was a bit of scrambling to do to get the copy ready in time, because it was suddenly highly relevant. And we were pleased that we were able to, Julie and I, to tell the story of people who were suddenly in the limelight, perhaps for the first time, and we felt we had a story that with their help to tell of perhaps a surprising story of life in the high-rise towers.
Oh God, a 6 week deadline or a six weeks span is almost unheard of in modern terms. So what happens to the art of storytelling? What's lost to both the product and to the community that's being unfairly reported on?
You mean when things are
when you have to respond to and react in a much more timely, out in a few hours?
Yes, well, this is where I think the journalist's art becomes very important. I think that what really counts is to try to build. We're talking about two kinds of journalism here, as you point out. There's the long form journalism where you actually have time to try to build relationships with people and build trust. And then you have that very sudden journalism when you might be thrown onto a story to a place you've never been that day to report for TV or radio that evening or for the newspaper the following day. Look, I think the principles are the same though at heart. They are about being respectful of people, being honest about the process, about how this is going to go, about one thing that is important to me is the whole question of, if you're writing something, do you show the people you're writing about the copy before it's actually published? And that's
the entire copy, or just their grabs?
Well, in the case of usually just their grabs, because I think it's important. Well, and often the context around it, so they get a sense. It's something that I've done a lot in my career as a journalist, and some people say, "Oh, you shouldn't do that," but I've never had. It's always been of a benefit for me to do that, because you actually get a richer story, because the person who's being written about corrects errors. It's so easy to make mistakes when you're hearing stories from people for the first time, over a phone, or, I come across you say it happened on Tuesday, it actually happened on Friday.
Yeah, right. But you've never had someone come back and try and retract what they have offered, or what they.
Look, I haven't. I can see that it could happen, and then I think the negotiation there is it's like when you're covering public figures, they understand the deal. Yes. If you're reporting on politicians or people in the media a lot, they understand that if you're asking them questions, you've identified yourself as a reporter, then whatever they say to you is public information. But for people who have never been in the media before and may never be in the media again, I do think there are issues around the way that they are reported on, that the reporter needs to, as best he or she can, to consider in the time they have, because those errors might be not seeming so important to the reporter, but they might be very important to the people involved, even if they aren't errors that cause them specific difficulty. Everybody likes to have their story told accurately. It's just and there's a feeling of, well, yeah, that's what I said, And so I understand that in very pressured deadlines, media deadlines, this can be difficult, but we have phones, and most people stick. In my experience, they stick with what they've said because it's what they believe. And our job as reporters is really to help them in a way to tell their story, as best they can, to put their argument as best they can. So, I've never really had a difficulty with it. In fact, I'd say that it's been a benefit overall to my reporting.
Thank you for those little, pearls of wisdom. I'll hand over to you in just a moment, but before I do, I'm going to introduce Nor Shanino. He's a young leader in his community and is passionate about the development and progress of young people. Nor has various skills and experience in community development space and has volunteered and worked in the community sector for more than a decade. He's the co-founder of the Ubuntu Project. It's a grassroots service provider which represents African Australian community, aiming to close the gap between true community needs and services provided. So James, I'll hand over to you. I know you have a bit you want to share with those who've joined us online. Then there'll be a discussion with Nord, and please keep your questions coming through the chat function. We'll get to them in about half an hour.
Thanks very much, Antoinette. We'll throw to Nora in a second, but just before we do, I might just make a couple of further points, and then Nora and I, as Antoinette said, we'll have a discussion. I think it's worth remembering that in the past 25 years, 4 million people have migrated to Australia. That's about 1 in 6 Australians has come to this country in the past 25 years. It's a huge change. And what is striking about that change to me is it's a massive story for media. It's a massive story in the politics of Australia and the coming together of Australia as a community. Over time, in the past, if you look at the first waves of post-war migration, migrants often came to the inner suburbs of cities. These days, more and more, because the inner suburbs are so expensive, people often move to the fringe of big cities. And the risk there is because they're living on the fringe, those communities are not covered. The stories that come out of those communities are not told because media is concentrated in the inner cities, and all our power centres are concentrated in the inner cities. So I think it's incumbent on journalists, on media organisations as much as possible to get out there, to get into, to develop a wider sense of the Australian community and of our big cities and of our regions as well. In the case of this particular story that Antoinette's been talking about, that I wrote with Julie Sago, this was about the flats, the high-rise flats, and yet there was that same, if you like, that sort of membrane between the flats as communities and the larger communities around them, and what was a very, very interesting and a privilege to do in this case was to be able to talk to people who had grown up in those flats. The question of how to report, as Antoinette rightly said, we had time to build those relationships. I think that the question of respect for the people you're writing about applies to anybody if you're a reporter, from whatever background they come from. But it is about trying to build trust. And if you're interested in a particular, as a journalist, if you're interested in writing about a particular community or a particular area, try to build relationships in the good times before there might be some conflict that gets reported on. See if you can find the people who come from that community and get to know them, try to take people out for coffee, just to build connections that will stand you in good stead. And I certainly think this happened once there was the hard lockdown applied on the Flemington and Kensington flats in July last year. I was able to talk to Nor, who I'd got to know, for example, through the reporting we'd done. And I think it might be worth bringing up Nor now, Marcus, because one of the things that was just really, really helpful in this process. As a journalist, you're always looking for storytellers, people who know how to tell stories, who have a really interesting perspective. And Nor is one of those people. I asked him for an hour interview and we ended up talking for 3.5 hours one Saturday afternoon. And everything he said was interesting. And I'm going to say this about you, Nor, because you won't say it about yourself, but he just brings a really rich perspective to Australian life, because he grew up in an Eritrean family that had lived in Libya, where his father had worked under the Gaddafi regime, not worked for them, but had worked in that society where that regime was in power, and he suffered under that regime. They were then refugees. Nor grew up in Sweden, so he had, until he was 13, he had the experience of living in a totally different society, and then of coming to Australia. And what's really interesting is that Nor's thinking spans the generation of his father's generation, and the next he's 34, 35, sorry to reveal your age, Nor, but the generation that's coming after, and those perspectives are very different. And he is someone who in his work every day with Ubuntu Project, with his close colleague Ahmed Dini, he's someone who spans that bridge, who bridges those two communities, but also the communities, some of the minority communities and the wider Australian society. So, Nor, I think we should just chat about, I've talked a bit about my experience as a journalist. Why don't you tell us a bit about how you see media from where you stand? Like, what has your experience of, growing up in Melbourne, what has your experience of media been? And how has that changed over time? And then you might just take us to the question of how you dealt with media during the whole lockdown period, the COVID-19 hard lockdown of the flats.
Absolutely. First of all, thank you everyone for having me and giving me this opportunity and those kind words, James. And luckily this is recorded now, so I can use that. Yeah, so like James said, childhood born in the Middle East, and lived in Sweden till I was young. So my childhood, I don't remember. I went to Sweden as almost 2 years old or something like that. And then moved to Australia at a very young age. In terms of my first experience or my experiences with media, I would look at it as there's probably 3 parts to it. I've been obviously thinking about this over the past week. Initially, it goes back to September 11. So I'm Muslim, and I was about maybe 14, 15 years old when that happened. And so I literally went from just one of the kids at school playing footy and basketball at lunchtime to all of these really difficult questions about my faith, about suicide bombings, about, you know, radicalization. And I had no answers because we didn't sit around the dining room table and discuss that. And, you know, I'd never been to a mosque where that was discussed. So we had no answers about that. And where the media played the role, obviously, going back to so long ago when I was so much younger, was just, it was being discussed all around the world, and rightfully so at the time. It was sort of a really key factor at that time. And what ended up happening was just, I would see panels and sort of news shows and things like that talking about Muslims and Muslims in the West. And this was happening in Europe and North America, where I've got lots of family. And a lot of times you didn't have Muslims on the panels. You'd have a security expert, you would have someone from government or politics, you would have people from media. And that was really difficult because it was just a stereotype, it was a certain perspective, it was one narrative, one side of the story that was being told. And for a lot of people, I think, you know, obviously it was something that was coming out of fear, but for us, it wasn't this discussion that was being had. I'll give you a quick example. There was a show, had a similar format to Q&A. So it was a question and a panel, and they would kind of discuss it. And I remember till now, I mean, it's 20 years ago, I remember what the question was, and it was, is Islam compatible with the West? And I'm sure for the producers and everyone on the show, obviously it was an important topic to discuss and talk about. But to me as a 15-year-old boy, it was my place in Australia that was being discussed. It was all very personal to me. It was about my family, my community. And without anyone there to represent our voices not being heard. And also I think just for a lot of people to try to understand the context, just the heightened fear of being labeled a terrorist or sympathizer or any of those things. And I remember my family and all of my friends' parents sitting us down and saying, don't even discuss it. Don't even, with your friends, not even at home. It was just this heightened fear. And it was a continuation sort of thing. And I remember just a quick example, when the Burke Street incident happened, I was sitting with a group of 12, 13-year-old boys, and somebody ran in and said, oh, there's something happened in the city. There was some sort of an attack in Burke Street. And I remember this 12-year-old kid, before I processed what happened, he said, I hope they're not Muslims that did the attack. That was the first thing that came into his mind. And I remember I asked him why, and he's like, oh, I don't want to be all over the news. And that's what he said, I don't want to be all over the news, because whenever they were talking about his faith, that's how he saw it. And so that was kind of left, I think, a bitter taste in a lot of people's mouths. And I think for a long time as a community, our stance for a lot of us was, we don't want to be on the news. We don't want to be spoken about. We just want to be left alone. It wasn't even about representation. And that's something I saw around the plebiscite vote in Australia. I met with a couple of, it was by coincidence, a couple of leaders of a faith, and they were setting up sort of an organization or group of all different faith leaders. And they actually said to me, we decided to not go to the Muslims first, assuming that they would just be on board. And they kind of spoke to a lot of different faith leaders. And when they ended up speaking to the Muslim ones, no one would engage. No one wanted to be on the news. No one wanted to, you know, support or even oppose or even be part of the conversation. So that's kind of the first part of my engagement.
Can I interrupt you there? Which plebiscite was on that? Which one?
Same-sex marriage.
Yeah, right. Gotcha. Yeah.
And the second one, which was a lot more pleasant, was actually with you, James, in this whole story. And I think just the biggest thing on that was I didn't know James. And I think had I just received an email saying we're writing this piece, I don't know if I would have engaged with that. But I think kind of, you know, knowing the Scanlon Foundation and having a lot of trust for Anthea Hancock, the CEO over there, I kind of thought, well, that would at least get him the benefit of the doubt. And right off the bat, and I assume we'll have a conversation about it, I realized, okay, I can see where the intentions are and things like that. And like you rightfully said, right after that, there was the hard lockdown at Flemington and North Melbourne. And I don't think I've said this to you, James, but I think if I didn't have that positive experience with journalists just before it, I think the way I would have dealt with media during the hard lockdown would have been really different. So that positive experience kind of allowed me to, okay, feel a bit more comfortable. And we did have somebody who had media background that was kind of walking us through it all and things like that. I'm not sure.
That's great, Nor. Tell us a bit more about that time, because it was a tense time, wasn't it? There was, you know, and I think, you maybe talk us a bit through the generational differences, right? So I think a lot of the younger people in the high-rise towers would have had a different view about what was going on compared to older people, and younger people also much more media savvy and kind of aware of the impacts media have. So tell us about what was quite a tense time. How did you navigate that period? How did you and Ahmed Dini, your partner at Ubuntu, how did you navigate that time? Because
yes.
you were right between the groups, weren't you? You were kind of ferrying messages, and you were getting a lot of media calls and talking to the DHHS, the Department of Health and Human Services, the police, lots of different people.
Yeah, well, I think first of all, we were one of many, obviously.
Yeah.
I think what a lot of people don't realize is when the lockdown happened, the response from community was not a planned or a structured one. It was very organic. A lot of people came on it to help out. We realized, oh, you're really good at something and it's been going well for, it went well yesterday. So you just kind of lead that. In terms of for Ahmed and myself navigating media and things like that, like I said, we were very fortunate that we had an amazing, talented young woman who had media background, had worked for a broadcaster, and was actually teaching journalism at that time. She's doing something slightly different now. And she was there to be able to kind of say, yep, that's a great publication. The way that person's kind of written about the community before is a bit problematic. And even to the point that, we would sit down in the mornings and we'd have our talking points for the day and say, here's the 3 things we're talking about. And that's the 3 things we're talking about. We're not taking any other questions. When there was something when something did happen, there wasn't so many things that were happening. But when things happen, we'd actually sit down and write a statement and have a bunch of volunteers. There wasn't from any one organization having a look at it and saying, okay, great, yeah, we sign off on it. We set up a central email that was overseen by that young lady. And anyone that would contact us would say, send an email to here and someone will respond to you, which, I mean, everyone here is in journalism and like, well, that's how you do it. We never had that experience. And if it wasn't for, there was other people involved, but that specific person was so important. Social media was a huge factor. That's where young people, I think, really came in, and they were kind of posting their own things, posting their stories, pictures of things. A lot of journalists were contacting them, even ourselves. It was emails and things like that, but it was mainly Instagram. That's where a lot of journalists were going, contacting people. So we actually organized an impromptu, just very quick, I think it went for 1 or 2 hours, media training. And we kind of told everyone, you live in the towers, you can speak to whoever you want, tell your story as you want. No one can tell you what you should and shouldn't do. But here are some people that have got some experience that could potentially contribute to that. And on the generational gap, first generation immigrants, especially if you come as refugees or asylum seekers, it's just, there's always a generational gap between every generation, but it's just so massive because you have parents that literally grew up in a whole different world. Everything was completely different. A lot of those countries they come from, like where I come from, there is no free media. So there isn't a lot of experience you can go back to. And even with the lockdown, again, like you said, my father lived, under Gaddafi's rule for quite a while. And what was normal was very different than Australia, which you mentioned some examples of that in the story. And, they would come in and say, well, yeah, I think everyone acknowledged that it was a health crisis. Everyone understood, even if not the way it was done, but some people, a lot of the parents kind of said, well, it's better than people dying, And for younger people, it was very nuanced because they understand how it works. And for them, it was a lot more about, okay, maybe we can, we don't have all the information to say whether the lockdown was required or not, but why is it automatically policing? Why weren't health professionals sit in? And so their questions were a lot more nuanced. Their questions was a lot more about, well, you've put us in the lockdowns. What did you put in place? What were the risk assessments? What logistics were put in place? And the Ombudsman report did say that, the head of DHS didn't even know till 15 minutes before the press conference. So there was nothing like that put in place. And that kind of is another contributing factor to when you're talking about new communities immigrating. You're not dealing with just one individual. They're part of a family and a part of a community. And these are cultures where a lot of times that comes first, that comes before the individual. And that's something that sometimes is really important to take into account when reporting on certain communities. And I'm sure, it's similar and very different with different communities.
I think you've raised a really important point there. Communities are very diverse, and one person might be a spokesperson for one part of the community, but not for another. And I think the more work that journalists can do to try to, uncover the complexity of those relationships, the better. And I totally take your point about social media and the role of social media, Instagram in a kind of crisis event like that. I still think, this is the old-fashioned journalist in me, there's no substitute for getting out there and getting face-to-face with people and asking them questions. And because, people get very fiery on social media as well, but when you get face-to-face, you can talk and explore the nuances of situations so much better. And I think it's important that journalists explain to people as well that the pressures they're under, that you might talk to someone from an hour and they might use one quote, or stories can be cut, headlines written by different people. I think it's really useful for journalists to explain those things to interview subjects in this process. And you must have seen, Nor, in the coverage, I'm guessing here, but you probably saw some really good coverage and some poor coverage. And you must have been struck by the kind of diversity of practice even amongst journalists. Yeah.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And I mean, at the time of the lockdown, we didn't have time to watch the coverage. My colleague Ahmed was actually in the tower, so he was in the lockdown.
Yeah.
So he was doing a lot more of the sort of live coverage and the TV stuff and things like that. I was more on the ground. But even with him, like, people would come up a couple of weeks later and say, "Oh, we saw you on channel whatever," and I'm like, I don't know. There was a camera in my face a couple of times.
Yeah.
But looking back, absolutely, we've seen that happen before. We've been, in the media before, about even the local paper, and definitely, I think what happens is, and it's really important for journalists, because everyone gets caught up in their little bubble. I was part of a media, I think, roundtable or workshop, you can call it, and they were talking about the diversity in media and the left and the right, conservative and liberal, and I was saying, a lot of young people in a lot of communities the media is the media. It's a generalization. It's not fair. And I think a lot of times, kind of even sort of setting the scene with that, explaining who you are. I get journalists I know nothing about. I haven't really got the time to research them all, just saying, "Hey, I want to write on XYZ and let me know if you're interested," And I think if you can send, like, here's something similar that I've written before. And, because there are people that do want to speak to the media, but there's still that fear and hesitation. And it does a lot of damage even internally, because within the community, there is still that mindset going back to 20 years ago, where it's, if you're in the news, all media is bad media. That still exists. And I think it only takes, 10 good experience, one bad experience. Everyone remembers that one bad experience. But like you said, if you can explain the process, I didn't know that a lot of times the headlines are written by somebody else. Like, I was just mind-boggling to me that there are editors that will cut things out, and I had no experience. And learning all of those things makes you realize, like, oh, they're also sort of in a difficult position. And I did use the example recently to you, James, where I said, imagine if someone came to me, that's how I look at it. Someone came to me and said, write an article on white middle-aged Christian women. I would have no clue where to start or who to talk to or how to do it. And it's not an easy job. Like you kind of already mentioned with Antoinette, that, if you're in news where there's quick turnaround, online publications, like, something happens, if it's not up in the next 5 minutes, you're too late. So it is really difficult. But the point you made about during the good times, creating those relationships, and again, a lot of sort of communities that we're talking about, diverse community, trust is a huge factor. And it's not about institutional trust. It's about individuals. Like, oh, I know James, kind of what happened with you, which is, I know Scanlon Foundation, they know James, I'll give him the benefit of the doubt, kind of thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, I think that, as you say, those things can be built over time. And I see that Anthea's just made a comment about the Guardian serializing this series, and they were interested in publishing it well before the lockdown, because I think they felt strongly that here was a community that nobody ever reports on. And unless there's something bad, maybe there's been a crime or something like that has happened, and then, so that is not a particularly, coming off some sort of trouble is not a particularly representative or rich way of describing describing a community. So I think The Guardian did want to do that. And it makes me think about the relationship between reporters reporting on a community and trying to encourage the community itself to speak. And I think both, there's a role for both. I think we need to get more voices, say from your community, Nor, where say there's been something like the hard lockdown in the flats. We would like to see, it would be great to have, say, people speaking directly in their own words, words not necessarily reported on by journalists, in op-ed pieces or to camera, and then have the reporting as well. I think there's a place for both to get a much more diverse picture of what is going on in Australia today.
And I think, media is changing and all these things, but, like Spider-Man's uncle told him, with great power comes great responsibility. And I think media has a big place, journalists have a big place, and, I'm a history buff. And, when people look back at this time, like this is how they're going to judge what the world was like, what the society was like. It's the words that journalists write, and it's the photos that photographers take, and the documentaries that filmmakers make. And it's really, really important. And it does sort of penetrate and get through. And, I guess individual journalists don't have a lot of power, but it's part of the collective. And it's not easy, if we just want to type up our, whatever it is, 500 words, and that's our focus, then, but like you said, it does take extra work. It does take more time. And to be honest with you, it's just that trust barrier. But people, and I said it earlier, James, young people want to tell their story. Young people want to express themselves. They do want to paint a picture, an accurate picture, not just a better picture. And that was our interest in getting involved. And I was myself sort of very interested in, and I don't know how much you had to do with it, but with the young people that were in the panel. So I think it is a lot of work, but I think it's very important. It's crucial work. I think, representation and multiculturalism are words that we use all the time, but really thinking about it and how it impacts people. Like when I was that 15-year-old boy, and even with this article, I've had so many people, like my own father, who sat down there and English is not easy for him and read the whole thing through. And he's not somebody who says a lot. And he said, oh, I read that article. And I said, how much? He said, the whole thing, which meant a lot. And then I said, what do you think? And he said, it's really important. It's important for Australia to know who we are. And then he said, because that's the only way we can ever become Australians, by learning of each other and accepting each other and being seen as, we're different, but we're all Australians at the end of the day.
That's fantastic, Nor. And before I hand to you, Antoinette, I just want to follow up what you just said and say that above all, I'd encourage everybody to engage. We've got to engage and have the conversations with each other. And there will be, misunderstandings and people will feel misrepresented at times. But I think openness to the conversation, both in life in general and in the media, is just vital. And Nor, you obviously, I think you would agree that obviously, I'm sure you've had some road bumps along the way, but overall engagement has been a good strategy for you overall. I think I'm right in saying that.
Oh, absolutely. I think it's even road bumps. I think it's people have the right intentions. Most people are good people, and it's been mainly positive, which is really great.
Thank you so much for the discussion so far, and people are obviously enjoying it and sending their questions through, so much so that one of their questions is, when can we get a recording? They like it so much they want to watch it again. So the recordings will be sent out at the conclusion of all of the sessions. It will come in your inbox, so you can watch it again. Another question that's come through, which is really important, I think, is how crucial is the gendered lens when we are looking and reporting on multicultural communities? Because it can be quite a different experience. Norden, you would know the experiences of a Muslim woman can be quite different for various reasons, from the physical to the social. How important do you think that is to ensure that all of that is covered?
That's for me.
Yes, it is not.
Yeah. Well, I think it's crucial. It's absolutely crucial. Like you said, it's so varied. I think that if we're going to talk about where majority of stereotypes lay, it's not just with, communities of different heritage, but it's usually with the women in those communities. And a quick example, we're doing I'm not going to get into it, but a whole bunch of work. And we had young women filming, they were doing a little act. And we had all these lawyers and things there, and it was about domestic violence. And in the act, the father was working, but the mother controlled all the money. And at the end, all the lawyers were confused, and they said, why did you have the woman that wasn't working, being the one controlling the money? And they just looked and said, that's how it works in our communities. What are you talking about? Like, you know, our mothers run the house, they make the final decisions. And they were just really taken back. And I think just gems like that really allow us to understand each other. I think with gender, it's crucial. Like, I don't even know how to describe it better than that. It's really important. And to be absolutely frank and honest, a lot of times within those communities, women's voices are sometimes not allowed the same platform, not allowed the same place. I know even when it comes to youth workers, there are so many more youth workers than myself in our community doing like all this work that I look up to, but they're not given the platform within the community that I'm given. And that's just how, unfortunately, the way that it is. And I think this is where journalism can play, or media more broadly can play a big role in even breaking down barriers that exist within those communities. And again, I think, you know, stereotypes, like I said, a lot of times it's, you know, when you talk about Muslims, you talk about Africans, it's all the women, they must be oppressed, they must not have this, they must not have that. And I think just meaning the nuance of that is really crucial.
And can I perhaps suggest it could be a shared responsibility, that of course it's up to a journalist to ensure that various perspectives, because there's not one Indigenous perspective or one Black perspective or one Arab perspective, but also when somebody gets approached to then ask, you know, one of the things I do, whether it's to speak at an event, who else is involved? Are you speaking to someone who's X, Y, and Z? That it's a responsibility where you can perhaps amplify women in your community, and journalists can ask the right questions to try and locate more voices. Another question for you, Nord. I'm assuming this is coming from someone from a diverse community. How can we get our stories out there? Because no doubt, you know, there is a bit of a growing trend towards constructive journalism, you know, journalism that's not just reactive, but journalism that proposes solutions. And so if you think you're sitting on a bit of a gem and your community has these stories, what's your advice, being at the community side, of how to get that across the line and into the media?
I think, again, in going back to the previous point, also apart from gender is the age difference. And I think with younger people, it's a lot more content creation. There's a lot more of them doing podcasts. There's a lot more of them doing filmmaking, animation. That's a lot of the methods we're using to communicate with them. I think with older people, like, again, and I think it's, to be honest, I think the lockdown was a really good example of where people were even, I remember people saying a week in, saying, oh, I can't believe the media hasn't turned on us. They were actually really surprised. They were expecting that they were going to be attacked, and kind of some of the things Pauline Hanson was saying, they were expecting it from mainstream media. And so I think really to get the word out, and a lot of times what I'll do, and I actually did it yesterday, is just give James a call and say, James, how does this work? And how does that work? And how can we do all of these kind of things?
So it's establishing those relationships when topics aren't hot necessarily, so that you can draw on them.
Yeah, and I think a lot of times that also can lead to resentment, where there is this sense, I've heard from young people saying, well, they didn't care about us yesterday. Now that something's happened, something bad's happened, now they're here. So that sometimes actually is very negative. So I think coming during the good times is really important. Reaching out is really important. And I think what's really crucial also is, and this is something James did really wisely in the group chat that we had, was that he didn't come in with a set of 10 questions and I want my 10 questions answered and, you know, I'm out. Not that all journalists do that, but sometimes it comes off the wrong way, and kind of a lot more open-ended, a lot more of saying, well, what's important to you? What stories do you want to tell? Coming from that, I think really makes people a lot more comfortable. And I work as a facilitator and run workshops, and we try to do that, to open-ended questions, see what they come up with. And we have some sort of an idea, but sometimes it ends up going places we never thought of ourselves.
And James, someone's interested in that struggle, because it's not industry standard, and there isn't a one way or right way of doing it when it comes to running grabs or quotes past interviewees. But what sort of pushback have you received from either your colleagues or your editor, and how did you respond as to, you know, how did you make your case that it's important that you get their approval and feedback?
I've never had any pushback at all.
Oh, really?
No, none whatsoever. I had a mentor when I was younger who did it, and he always said it was a good practice for him, and I followed that. Look, when I was a news reporter, I don't think I would have done it all the time if I was in a if it was a very rushed situation where I had to get copy out. But I did often try to do it as much as possible within the constraints of time. With people who are not public figures, I wouldn't do it with public figures.
Yeah, sure.
People understand the game. But I think the thing is, people often forget, if you're in a long conversation with someone, you're saying, tell me your story about, tell me about your life here in this place. After an hour, they've forgotten that you're a reporter. You're just chatting as two people,
Yeah.
And they could be telling you all sorts of intimate things, personal things that might actually expose them later to problems, And I do think there's a duty of care there to say, to just say, look, this is what you said to me. Is it okay?
And Nor, I'll get your perspective. Did that help make you more comfortable with James's journalism?
Well, I just smiled at the last point he made because I wasn't expecting to get a copy, to be honest. I didn't even think about that. And like he said, after an hour, you forget that they're a journalist. Well, we spoke for 3.5 hours and it went from footy to our fathers to everywhere. And when I read the copy, I was like, oh, I can't believe I put that person's name in there. And it wasn't anything like major or things I don't want to get into, but it was little things that I knew, like some people wouldn't be uncomfortable with, little things in there that I know would rub certain people the wrong way. But to be honest, that really sort of did make me a lot more confident because I knew what was happening. I knew what was being written. I knew how things were being represented. And, I've had other experiences afterwards and I've never had anyone send me a copy or anything like that. It's usually, I'll usually ask, say, can you send me a copy once it's published myself? But definitely, I think is really crucial. But I think also, again, it probably goes back to the point of long form, short form. If it's
yes, of course.
in the news today, or if you've got, potentially 6 weeks to work on it, it does make a difference. But I think it's really crucial, and especially when you consider coming from this place of distrust or kind of uncomfortable with media, I think that would go a long way towards building trust.
And a very valid question has come through. How can we do or expect inclusive reporting when it's coming from newsrooms where there's no diversity?
Maybe I'll jump on that one first, Antoinette. So I haven't been a working journalist now for about 10 years in a newsroom, so I'm not across. And Antoinette, you'll be better placed in some ways to answer that question in terms of diversity, as you said. Obviously, we've got further to go, and is there no diversity? I think we're at
very little.
Start. Yeah, so we've got a lot further to go, and it's just really interesting to think about the Age newspaper where I used to work. It's hired its first Indigenous reporter covering Indigenous issues just in recent times, and that's to be applauded. And yet, as I say, there is we need to broaden the space of voices in this country. There is no doubt, and I do believe that is happening, but it's by no means nowhere near a finished process. So what I'm saying there is I don't think it's static. I think there is there is change, and change will take time. And I guess what I can add to this is, often a pushback to that kind of question would be, well, if you're a good journalist and a trained journalist, surely you can approach any subject matter where, and you can apply your journalistic principles of, objectivity and fairness and balance. And I don't believe that's the full story in the way all stories are comprehensively told. So James, you're obviously a very skilled Walkley award-winning journo. And while I don't question your ability to tell stories, it's more about your community reach or insights into certain issues, your lived experience, your contacts book, who you went to school with, where you grew up, they're all the sorts of things that you don't get from journalism school. And so I guess while things are changing, to answer the audience member's question,
there are journalists who want to do better, who may not be diverse themselves, and there are ways that they can better enrich and broaden their journalism. And there's some of the ways that James answered, forge those relationships, build trust, engage a bunch of community voices. There isn't one Muslim voice or one Indigenous voice, and it's quite easy for the media to keep engaging that one person with the one perspective that often doesn't represent the whole community. Just as a little practical tool, Media Diversity Australia has an expert database on our website. And so it's people from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds. They're not journos, but they're lawyers and domestic violence advocates and economists who just so happen to be perhaps Indian or speak Mandarin. And I think it's also about normalizing what expertise is, and that expertise comes in different colors, shapes, and sizes. And it's not always, a white guy in a suit from a sandstone university who's an expert. And so I guess that's in the shorter term a way newsrooms and the media can better reflect the expertise and the lived experiences of multicultural Australia.
I'll just jump in and say, I totally agree with you there. And I just wanted to say one thing on top of what you just said, which is there may be times when it is better for an outsider to cover a community dispute. There might be times, say to groups within the Indigenous community, there's a land claim, and that somebody from inside that community could play some role in writing something, but often it can be a lot of pressure to be actually, if you know the people involved, if you're expected to cover it in a certain way or to take a certain side. So if I were an editor, I absolutely would be wanting to work hard to expand the number of voices, but I would sometimes want to say better, and that person doesn't have to be, they could be from any background, it doesn't, but somebody perhaps outside a community can actually, provided they do the sort of things we've discussed tonight, they can actually, it's easier to.
Yeah, of course. And, and sometimes you don't, I grew up in Western Sydney, and, my parents are Lebanese and they came as refugees. And sometimes I didn't always want to do the stories about Western Sydney, and I didn't always want to do stories about Middle Eastern youth, and and so there's also that danger of pigeonholing certain stories, and also offered for Indigenous people, it comes with a lot of trauma, and navigating trauma from within the community. So it's a difficult balancing act. But to your point, having a range of journos in the newsroom, and you can go, okay, you know what, James, you're better placed to cover this, or Antoinette will send you off to this. Nor, a question for you: do you have any advice to Muslim journalists who are starting off?
Oh God, journalist. Well, just quickly on the previous point.
Yes, sure.
On the other side of that, where people, it happens with women. I think it happens a lot with women, and it happens a lot with people, color or different ethnic backgrounds. Once they get into the newsroom, they're expected to kind of do what every other journalist does, and I've heard stories of being said, well, this is how we write it here. Well, that defeats the purpose of having a multicultural staff in the first place. And so I've heard stories of people getting jobs in mainstream news and then feeling really sort of boxed in and not allowed to express themselves. So I think just having people that look different in the newsroom, that is not the end all be all, obviously, which no one's suggesting that it is, but I think then it's also benefiting from that.
Yeah, and it also puts a lot of pressure on that person who might be 23 and good intentions and highly intelligent and motivated to go in there and change the culture of the newsroom. It takes time, and it's not until people have real editorial influence and power at news director levels, board levels, that things really, executive producer levels, that things really begin to shift.
As for the current question, Muslim journalists starting up, I mean, I'm not a journalist, I don't work in that world, but just as a person coming into an industry where I've been part of the minority, I guess you could say, is be assertive, kind of speak up, you're in there, you've got a privilege, you've got an opportunity, I assume there's some sort of brainstorming sessions, really speak up. I think for a lot of times, and I've seen this with friends that have gone into the police force, I've seen it with friends going into other industries where they are extreme minorities. And a lot of times that's a bit overwhelming, and you want to you end up in a situation where you might be, you don't want to stand out. You don't want to point yourself out, especially if you're very young, you're just getting started. So it's, I mean, you're in there, you've got an opportunity, you know, speak up, you know, and you know, it's going to be a process. You're not going to come in on day one, like you kind of said, Antoinette, and change everything and change how media has worked in this country for 130 years or whatever it is. But it's just going in and, you know, be assertive. Don't, you know, you've got an opportunity and potentially you can open a door for so many other people that come in after you, and you've got a platform. But again, you're a journalist. It's not all on your shoulders as well. And if, you know, like you said, they don't always want to write about just their community, just their experience. They want to have a range of experiences. That's fine as well, you know. But it's the most important thing. I think we're at a point where it's about representation. We want to have people in the room, and then it's, you know, again, we want the people we have in there also being diverse, because our communities also are diverse.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would just add to that, to the person who sent that question through, you know, find allies in the space. There are more people. It might not be in your newsroom. It might be in a sister publication or another newsroom. Media Diversity Australia is a good place for that, whether it's, you know, online support, going to networking events. When you feel that it's not only you experiencing certain things or unsure how to navigate this space, it helps. And part of the reason we started it is we all had at one point in our experience recognized what it felt like being the only brown person in a newsroom. And so just having mentors, having people just to text on a WhatsApp group and have a bit of a vent, just so you don't feel you're alone. That's probably my advice to somebody who's starting out, who comes from a minority group. We have a question, and this is a really good one, actually, for both of you. In my writing for a professional magazine, this person tries to include stories from a diverse range of groups, and the intention is to show diversity of the profession and give as many people possible a voice. But I sometimes worry it could look like tokenism. How can that be avoided? And this is often the pushback, either by those trying to support diversity initiatives or those who are diverse themselves, to feel that their inclusion or attempts at inclusion are going to be dismissed as tokenistic. James, do you have any thoughts here?
Yeah, it's a good question, Antoinette. I think, you know, I think it sort of depends really what the story is about to some extent as well. And other people that you're seeking comment from always go obviously for the most people who are most relevant to the story. I think within that, if you can then ensure, you know, diversity of voices, that's great, and work towards that. But sometimes the question of diversity of voices will be more germane to the story than at other times. And I think as a practice, it's a good thing to do. But I think it's particularly what Nor was saying. I think Nor really described it very importantly before when he talked about his experience of September the 11th and was feeling talked about without having a chance to participate in that conversation. I think that's when it becomes really crucial that a wider range of voices are heard, you know, openly and in good faith. And so I think that's when that issue of the diversity becomes really, really central. So yeah.
Nor, did you have anything to add to that?
Just kind of to say, yeah, I think it's really important, and I think the criticism of tokenism is going to be there.
Yeah.
And at the end of the day, I mean, you know, your intentions the best, and sometimes this change takes a while. There might be things that appear to be token today, but you know, if we keep doing it, it becomes normal. And that's what the goal is, right? We want to normalize it. Having, you know, a Muslim woman write an article, having, you know, a person of color hosting a show should not be a thing. It should just be a normal thing. We're not going to get there until we just see it regularly. We see it all the time. And I think really importantly, but also I think when it becomes tokenism is where you just want someone that looks different but kind of tells the same story.
Yeah, that's really important. And I think your point about intention is really important. So if your intention really is to amplify a range of voices, I think that's crucial. If sometimes you miss the mark, and sometimes we do, you know, I did a story, you know, even though I'm a diversity advocate, I did a story on disability, on ADHD, and I didn't realize the language I was using was quite either dismissive or simplistic. My intentions were great. But what I did with the feedback, I got a whole bunch of people, quite a few were angry at Twitter going, this, you know, it was simplified us, it you know, it was not nuanced and I was mortified. But I think what's telling is what you do next. And it's going, okay, what did I do wrong? How can I do better? And so I would say to that magazine writer, do what you're doing with your intentions. And if someone feels that they've been only slotted in and treated tokenistically, I think we're all just learning and growing, and change takes time, and it'll make people uncomfortable, including yourself, until, as you say, Nord, having a Black person anchor a program is not a novel idea. It just becomes the norm. I have another question. What role does effective inclusive reporting have on social cohesion in Australia? Short answer, a lot. James, I'll pass over to you for the longer answer.
Absolutely, because the more that, and it sort of goes to Nor's point just then about, you know, the people who present the news, the more that the voices of the fullest range of people in this country are heard in the media, the more we start to see ourselves as that very diverse community. And that does take time, but it's a critical, media is such a big part of the way we come to understand ourselves beyond the people we know through our own, you know, small networks of friends and family. We come to know the community through media. And so how do we come to see ourselves in the fullness of our Australianness, you know, with all its diversity? Media plays a vital role. So yes, to the questioners, a big role.
Nord?
What's bigger than big? You know,
yeah.
It plays a massive role. But I think what's important in that question is, a part in that question is effective, right? Inclusive reporting. And I think a lot of times that's the difference between tokenism and being real. And I think a lot of times, and James, we've spoken about this, where we oversimplify things, where a lot of times when you're talking about people of color, you'll hear, you know, refugees. And I had a 16-year-old the other day that read something, and he said to me, at what point do we stop being refugees? You know, when does that actually stop? When is that how they describe our community? Why is that the one thing that they go through? And look, sometimes it's relevant to the article, it's relevant to the point. You know, and it's there for a purpose, but I think this shorthand is an issue. And, you know, a lot of times, and again, James, we spoke about this recently, it's not just the people that write the worst things, but it builds up to it. You know, it's like with everything else, there's a build up period, things become normalized, you get one step closer. And always using, you know, refugee or immigrants and things like that in an article where it's not relevant.
Yes.
It kind of opens the door for the next level.
Can I just add to that, Antoinette? I think Nor is right there. And I think sometimes people use the word refugee with good intent because they want to show that this community has struggles, you know, but I actually think the difficulty that you're pointing to, Nor, is that communities that come from refugee backgrounds are often incredibly resilient by virtue of the refugee experience. And that is something that is lost, I think, if there's too much focus on refugee as a term of vulnerability. So sometimes that term will be used with good intent, but I think it tends to pigeonhole and to kind of miss the real sort of strengths that exist in those communities. And so there's probably a better way to describe communities, especially if you've been here for 20 years or something. At what point, as you say, is that community still a refugee community?
Another question, and probably actually to both of you, any tips on sourcing reliable, neutral translators? So if a story could be, you know, contentious within a community, being able to engage somebody who can help you with language barriers, who doesn't bring their own personal views to relaying the information. I've got no experience in this realm, so I'm not sure if you do, James.
I've got none either. It's a great question. I just don't have it just comes down to networks, I think, and you might try someone and see how it goes. You know, I don't have better answer than that. Often young people whose you know first language is English can help, I think, with older people in the community. What do you think, Nor?
I think exactly right. I think young people, a lot of them struggle to speak their mother tongue. English is their main language. So, you know, a lot of times you know, when we say young people, look, I mean, you know, a lot of these, especially specifically talking about our communities, especially like East African community, being in this country for 30 years, you have 25, 28-year-olds born in the country, you know, people like my father, you know, the grammar might be a bit off and they might struggle with certain points and things like that, but they can have a conversation, they can read the news. And I think depending on the languages, there are a lot of services that you can access. A lot of, you know, just a simple example is in Victoria is the Multicultural Commission, who on a daily basis works with multicultural communities. They've got a whole network that you can access into and get into. That obviously becomes more challenging when it's those really like language groups that are, you know, very few numbers. You don't have a lot of options in that. And a lot of times young children, you know, I know from the age of 8, 9, we were translating for our parents, you know, so they're actually really good at it. You know, and I think that in terms of the question, in terms of biasness, a lot of them is just, they just want to explain what their parents are trying to say. They're trying to explain what the older person is trying to get across to you. I think you will struggle to speak to older people anyway, but I think, you know, majority of the community, I'd say 75% are born or grew up in this country, went to school in this country. So it is a challenge, but I think it's going to be a very rare challenge.
And I think it would also depend on the complexity. So people will sometimes come to me in the newsroom and say, can you help us? You know, we need this grab from the Egyptian president saying blah, blah, blah. And I can locate it, but I certainly don't have the skills to adequately transcribe and translate something. And so I think when somebody requires that level, you need to go to an accredited translator who isn't just bilingual, but can actually do verbatim word for word. And, you know, I'm not sure what those accreditations are, but you can find them and request that. So that would be my recommendation in ensuring things aren't lost in translation. Somebody has said, would you guys be keen on collaborating on an article together? Amazing panel tonight. I mean, if someone wants to commission us, we can certainly talk about it. Another one is cultural communities carry a huge burden to tell their story. Is the onus on the cultural community to educate the wider community, or is it a responsibility of the wider community? Sorry, I'm just trying to get to the bottom of the wider community to learn and listen or share that burden. So is the onus on the cultural community to educate the wider community, or is it a responsibility of the wider community to learn and listen or share that burden? Nor, do you have any thoughts on that?
I think the reality is it should be on both sides, kind of meet in the middle, because if someone doesn't want to learn about your culture or your community, no matter what you do, it's not going to get through. You know, and at the end of the day, if you wanted to learn about my community, I would have to participate in that. So I think it's somewhere in the middle, and I think where a lot of the challenges happen is exactly in that. You have people, I would do this thing when I started working at what's now Woolworths, used to be Safeway, and I'd work in different stores, and I'd actually go in and say, oh, my name's Nor, and I start working with someone, and I would just say, I'm Muslim, because it was all over the news. And I would ask them, I'd say, have you ever met or worked with or spoken to a Muslim or someone from Africa? And a lot of times people eventually, after, you know, it goes on, they'll say, no. And I say, oh my God, this is your chance. Ask me all your questions you want. And you would see how it start off very sort of, you know, they don't want to say anything, and then it will get to the real questions. And every single time that happened, they would come back with more questions, because all of a sudden, you know, they're getting answers to things that are all over the news and all over the place. You know, I was going to do it was an anti-racism campaign, and they wanted me to go in and speak. And I said, those of you in Melbourne will understand, if you're going to take me to a library in Brunswick or all these multicultural areas, I don't see the purpose. I'm like, take me to an RSL in rural Victoria. I would love to speak to them, you know, because my mindset is I want to give them the opportunity. And if they do want to learn, it's there. It only benefits all of us as Australians and Victorians and whatnot. But I think on the other hand, you know, if you're part of, I guess, white Australia, you do have a responsibility, because, you know, we're here, we're not going anywhere, we're part of Australia. Like, you know, James, you said earlier on, over 4 million in the last 25 years. Your children are going to go to school with our children, and we're all going to be part of each other's lives. And if we want to, you know, multiculturalism, cohesion, whatever label you want to put on it, at the end of the day, it makes us all it makes Australia a better country. So I think ideally you'd want to meet in the middle, where if they want to learn, you know, and again, I don't want people jumping on Google and learning about my culture. I'd rather them have a conversation or learn about my faith or any of those things. So yeah, that's, I guess, my answer.
Do you get sometimes discouraged to engage with the media? I mean, I know that there can be quite a lot of hostility, particularly from groups that have been marginalised by the media.
Yes, I do. That I'll be honest. A lot of them, because you get 10 of them in one day about the exact same thing. You know,
10 of what? 10 of what?
10
10 journalists?
Yeah, you know, it's 10 requests. Like I said, it's not much information there. So it's like, well, I need to research every single one of them and look up the articles before I can make an informed decision. And so a lot of times I probably won't even respond, or, you know, if it's somebody I know, or I'll reach out, like that young lady that I knew, and I'll say, hey, I got this request. What do you think? You know, so again, having those connections is crucial to opening more doors for journalists. You know, so yeah, there are times where I'm very hesitant. I'll be honest, depends on the publication, depends on the broadcaster. That is a huge factor for myself.
James,
so there are some that I just would not.
Yes, I think. Look, I'm going to agree with Nor. I think the onus is on both sides. Antoinette, if I just want to pick up the question from Jorge Jordan that he has asked about, which is in the chat, about a lot of people consuming news.
Yes, I saw that.
Overseas.
Describing my father. Yeah.
It's a great question, and I think, and this, Nor, you talked about this a lot too, that in the move from when you were a teenager to today, you've seen the rise of the online world and the way in which, for young people, the political framework is global today rather than just inside Australia. Now, that's an inevitable process of online. I think you felt that it had some downsides to it in terms of people. You were, I think, feeling that it was important that people understood the realities of the place they lived in on a day-to-day basis. And then I think you said to me, we came to understand our world firstly as the high rise in Flemington, and then a larger collection of high rises around that, and then the city more broadly, and those concentric circles going out. Whereas today, young people who are online a lot might understand more about the world globally than their own community. So Jorge, to answer your question as best I can, we just have to really push great Australian storytelling as much as we can so that people can understand what's going on here in this place and how it might be different from what's happening in the United States, for example, a country which we're extremely influenced by, but which we are not the same as. And, you know, the reality here is different. Nor, what do you think?
I agree with that. I think, you know, I mean, my father is a bit all right, but like 99%, they've got the little setup gadget and it's the news from the other side of the world. Yep. They fully understand the language and they've still got family back there. So it's really crucial. A lot of them are sending money every month. So they're heavily involved in what's happening back wherever home might be. And I think for young people, yeah, I think for all of us, right? Our world was our home, then it's your street, then it's your neighborhood. That's just how you grow up, and then it expands and expands. But I see now, like even with my nephews and nieces, it starts internationally. Especially, I think, like the young people I work with, especially people of sort of African or Black color, a lot of what's happening in England, what's happening in America, what's happening in Canada has a huge influence on them. And you know, I remember me and Ahmed were sitting with a bunch of young people, and we asked them who the Prime Minister of Australia was and the Premier, and they had no clue. I think now with COVID and the daily briefings and Googling the numbers every day, they're learning a lot of those things. You know, but it's really crucial. It's really important. And I think they're living in a global world, you know, and I think that they need to know what's happening around the world, what happens on the other side of the world, what somebody says in England or somebody does, or a shooting that happens in America is important over here. But at the same time, it's got to be a balance.
I think I might add to that in some ways it's generational. That often, you know, first wave migrants or refugees like my father, who's, you know, fixated on his satellite channels. But I think with the next generation, there's a real business case that's not being capitalized on. So when we talk about the need for diversity, it's not just the touchy-feely stuff that we've been talking about when it comes to social cohesion and multiculturalism and nuance. It's also a business model. Your audience is changing, and Australian media isn't catering to its entire audience, and it's problematic in a digital global world, where if you're not getting the kind of content that resonates with you, you've got social media, you've got United States content, UK content, or content from your country of origin. And so I guess that's what frustrates me, that it's not only bad for multiculturalism and social cohesion, the entire business case is being overlooked, that clicks and eyeballs, you're missing out on those because you think your audience is still white Australia policy in the 60s, and it's evolved and it's changed, and people are impatient. They're not as loyal. We're just not as loyal. We're not as loyal to our banks as we once were. We're not as loyal to, we don't have as much faith in institutions. So I think it's up to not only the individuals from diverse backgrounds to try and better engage with the Australian media. The Australian media needs to do a better job of of curating and putting forward content that actually connects with them and reflects their interests and their world experiences. We have, this is a good question. Just wondering, Nor, what are some of the most irritating questions you are commonly asked?
God, I think a lot of the media I've done with James was great. It wasn't a lot of questions. He just let me talk for 3.5 hours. I'm trying to think of a really bad one.
Give us a few. Give us your top 3 hits.
Oh God, I don't even think I have top 3. But you know what it is? It's a lot of times where it's what's behind it, and they're trying to direct you towards a certain way. So they'll say something like, "Oh, tell us." Like I've had people ask me about women in my community. That's my number one. And I'll say, I can give you a few phone numbers. You can talk to them. Like I don't think you should be asking me, about that. Also, it's the sort of, they want the conclusive answers. Like, what does your community think of X?
Yeah.
There's thousands upon tens of thousands. And what community are you talking about? The Muslim community, the ones that came here as refugees. You're talking about public housing. You're talking about people of color. I'm part of so many different communities. Which one are you referring to? Which one are you talking about? And it's the one where they'll get in contact with us, and we work mainly with public housing residents and people of African heritage, and they don't want to use the word African or Black, and it's just this vague, and sometimes I'll say, "Oh, so you're talking about African Australians," and they'll say, "Well, I'll say, well, let's have the conversation. Like, you're not contacting me to talk about white people. You're not contacting me to talk about, Christians or whatever it might be." So I think that's really irritating. For me, and I get it, it's the eggshells and it's just the culture today, and no one wants to say the wrong thing. And, and I think, Antoinette, you mentioned that earlier, where people are going to make mistakes. You're not going to learn unless you make mistakes. I work as a facilitator, and I go from one group of young kids and say one thing, and it's, okay, that's how they say it. And then, you'll go to another group and they say, actually, we don't like the term culturally and linguistically diverse. Can you not use it? There are groups I'll go in and they'll say, we're not African Australian, we're African. You go to another group and say, we're Australians. I'm born here, I'm raised here, and I think you've got to be willing to take those risks, because that's the only way you're going to learn and figure out that it's a very nuanced culture. Everyone is different. Not all Muslims are the same. Not all Black people are the same. Not all women are the same. Everyone's very nuanced. And if you're not going to, have an honest conversation respectfully and be willing to take risks, then, you're not really going to get to the meaty stuff.
Great. We have time for probably a couple more questions. So if anybody has anything that they've been sitting on and really want to ask, please shoot. James, do you have any additional comments you want to make? I know that we have that hit list that's going to be sent out, some pointers for good storytelling when it comes to reporting on diverse communities. Do you have like your top 2? Like, if people were only to take 2 things away from this, what would it be?
Oh, look, thanks, Antoinette. I think it's really about the themes we've hit a number of times tonight about respect, face-to-face interaction, getting to know people as much as possible, understanding that I think that everybody has an incredible story to tell if you've got the time to listen and hear it. And, we've all been shaped in certain ways. I mean, one thing that was really striking to me interviewing Nor and other people from the high rise was just the incredible complexity of life in the flats, and you know, the way people ate, the way people studied. I mean, you know, Nor talked about the way, you know, when he was growing up, no one had much money, so often you'd be doing your homework on the floor, sitting cross-legged. There'd be an elderly gentleman who would turn up once a week for dinner, and he would just be brought in for a meal. And, you know, there was no invitation, there was no, you know, and then Nor went to Northcote High School where a friend would say to him, look, my mum said you can come around for dinner next week at 5 o'clock or for a playtime, you know, at 5 o'clock next week. And he's thinking, why do we have to plan this? Where I grew up, you know, people would just, you know, go and knock on the door. And so it was like the deeper you go into that community and into into the high-rise towers, the more complex and the more interesting they became in terms of sport, in terms of food, in terms of relationships, in terms of how those communities related to their home countries. It was a big issue. Nor was it like, you know, you know, like your dad with this setup for his media, but then, you know, the younger people doing it a different way. And all of those things are really interesting, you know, and they are, so it's about, you know, the detail is so interesting. And if you can build those relationships and focus on the detail of life, I think there are really powerful stories that will give us a richer understanding of ourselves.
And James, there's another question for you in terms of the photographer that worked on that series with you. You know, how closely did you work together? Because often, you know, images, particularly in our digital world, images can often tell a whole story or really shape a story. How important was your collaboration with the photographer, and how did that work?
Yes, the photographer did a great job, and I'm embarrassed to say his name has escaped me. I don't know him personally. He took photographs for The Guardian. Do you remember, Nor, his name?
Chris Hopkins.
Chris Hopkins, yeah, well done. Well done. He did a great job. And in some ways, Nor is better placed to speak than I am, because I didn't go out with him. Often as a journalist, you'll know this, Antoinette, you go out with cameraman or photographer and you work together, you know, and the photographer can be a really helpful partner in the process because, you know, they can, you know, they ask you questions, and while they're taking photos, you know, you can be sort of scouting around. But Nor, I'm interested to hear from you. I mean, your experience with Chris and the photos he took, because he took some terrific shots, I thought.
Oh, he absolutely did. So yeah, I mean, I've never had anyone take my photos. I'm barely on Instagram, and I'm very self-conscious. And he got in touch. We made the time, and he ended up having to take the pictures quickly, like you said. The article was changed around the deadline, and it was during the lockdown. So he actually had to come down, meet outside the mosque, and we were standing on the main road right where I grew up. And you know, he's got a light on me, and it was a bit awkward, but really nice guy, great guy. You know, had a lot of conversation, told me about other projects he's worked on. And
did you have a look at the photos over his shoulder to get an idea, or did you just see it when they were published?
He seemed to know what he was doing. And he took a lot of pictures, but he did take pictures again for a follow-up article that recently was published as well. So we met up then, and he actually gone back to creating contacts and networks. He texted me this morning. I said, hey, because the last time we met, he was talking about something and he mentioned the Walkley Foundation. And I said, oh, I'm actually doing a thing, you know? And so we had a whole conversation about it. So he texted me this morning saying, hey, I'll be watching it today. Good luck, you know? So
right. Well, there's a good example of, you know, keeping your contacts and building on your relationships. And well, I think that's a nice note to end on. Thank you so much for your time and your expertise, Nor, for your passion, James, for you just bring so much integrity and expertise to our craft. And, you know, one thing I've learned just from listening to you, the art of listening for 3.5 hours. And I just don't think we're necessarily doing enough of that. For those who have joined us, you will receive an email from the Walkley Foundation in the next few days. It will have some more information about the session, which the next month's session in this series. And you'll also get more information about when and where you can get this recording. So thank you so much for joining us. Enjoy the rest of your evening.
And Antoinette, thanks to you for a great job as well.
No worry. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you all. It was a pleasure.
Terrific. Thanks, everybody.